You are listening to the We Need to Talk About Oscar podcast, and this is our spoiler-filled conversation with Pat Scola, the cinematographer of A Quiet Place Day One and Sing Sing.
Yeah, man, it was a pretty beautiful process, and it was honestly, it's a way that I wish you could make everything, or I wish every set could feel that way. Reality is that they don't, and it was sort of like, who knows, it might be the only time in my life that it gets to happen exactly that way. I don't know, but it was wonderful.
We have this little forming tradition on the show where we start by asking our guests about how they fell in love with films in the first place. So Pat, what's your story?
That would be a hard thing to pin down, but I would say like my earliest memories of films are it was at my grandma's house, and my grandfather was he was like a big film buff, not like in the classic sense, but he was just every Friday, Saturday night, it was like a movie. He was like, and this was like back in the Blockbuster days when there was a bit more of, when you go to the video rental store, and there was a bit more of a choice involved, and when we're cycling through streaming today, I don't know if it really is the same commitment to like a singular film that you're going to watch today, something different about it. But I remember we used to go to the video store Friday, Saturday nights, and that was his thing. We would just watch movies all the time, and nothing like, I think I remember watching Blade Runner with him as like a child who maybe shouldn't have been watching Blade Runner, but like didn't really understand what the movie was about or what was happening. But I would say like that's kind of like my early memories of it. And I don't know if that imprinted or made me want to go down that route. I'm not really sure, but I always in high school always had a video camera, was really into skate videos, did a lot of that. I was also like, I spent most of high school in a dark room for still photography. So there was always some kind of camera interest occurring. I don't really think I ever thought it would kind of go to this though. I feel it's kind of just series of events kind of, I don't know, laid it out and it just kind of happened. Couldn't really say that it was like you never really expect it, maybe. That makes sense.
Absolutely does. And to steer our conversation a little towards nowadays, as today we have not one, but two of your projects on our plates, A Quiet Place Day One and Sing Sing. Taking a step back, looking at these two films from the outside, in the former you have three people logged into the world they know in an unknown scenario, while in the latter we get to sense how people behind bars can still experience freedom. I know this is a little weird connection that I just made, and I'm sure you have to handle different projects separately, individually, but at the same time, do you think about the way they relate to one another and the order in which one you take on follows the other?
It's interesting you say that. Also, these films are coming out around the same time, but interestingly enough, I did shoot them back to back. I shot Sing Sing first, which, was like a crew of 20 of us. And it's like, just over $1 million budget or something. And then on to finish that and went almost straight into A Quiet Place, which is, obviously a much bigger budget and sort of a New York invasion with monsters and aliens. But I think if you've seen both films, I do think there is something they have in common. I think there's something that draws me to both of them, because even though they're very, not just textually different, they're very aesthetically different, obviously. They're very totally polar opposite approaches to kind of how to make a film. But I do think that both of them carry a very heavy human story, which is, I think, what drew me to both of them. Quiet Place, as much as it's about the franchise and the monsters, I think if you've seen it and now if you've read enough about it, you kind of understand that it really is a story about Sam, this woman who is, dying of cancer and ultimately kind of taking death back on her terms throughout the film. I found that incredibly compelling from a story standpoint. I thought that was magical to kind of to be able to be a part of it and kind of capture a performer's journey through that. Similarly, I think I don't kind of actually have to explain why Sing Sing is just basically about being a human being. In most cases, for those men, it was about finding that humanity and taking it back for themselves and taking ownership over that humanity that was taken from them. So, I do think there is a common thread in between them, even though if you were to zoom out and look at them, it would be really hard to see that.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned the topic of the budget, because in the case of Day One, we seem to get used to studio movie budgets basically starting at, I don't know, $100 million. But this films was reportedly 67, which is, as far as I know, despite the, I don't know, inflation, pandemic, and so on, only 7 more than the second Quiet Places. Now, I don't want to get into business, economics and stuff with you, but in your field of work, what do you perceive or experience from this during a shoot?
It's weird. I don't really think about it too much. Each one is different, and I kind of approach each film as its own thing. I never really feel that it would be very hard to relate an approach. For example, to relate any approach from Sing Sing to any approach from A Quiet Place, except for just the storytelling and the things that you kind of want to capture, the emotions that you want to capture, I guess is maybe the better way to say it. But I'm not sure, I think I kind of go into each one just thinking about what is this film and what is the right way to approach this individually, regardless of, and that's like obviously taking into account the budgets, but I don't know. To me, the process is all really like similar. You're scaling up and you're scaling down. Like, you're like, you're resizing something, but the process doesn't change for me. It's like, obviously Quiet Place, I need to spend 12 weeks or 14 weeks, whatever I spent in prep, because we have so many big set pieces. We have so many things that kind of have to be worked out, so many conversations that need to be had. Sing Sing, I think we prepped for 3 weeks because it's a lot simpler technically. But ultimately, you're still kind of doing the same thing in that time period. You're still figuring out the most elegant human way to kind of tell this story or execute the story. So the process kind of remains the same. It's just how it expands or gets smaller. But I like both. I think that I quite like having a box. I think actually when you have a box, it's really interesting because I find some of the best work comes out of being placed in a place where you are required to come up with solutions, creative solutions that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise done if you had every manner of whatever tool, budget, approach. And like, even Quiet Place, like it is a big budget, but it's not, when you start to think about the amount of stuff that is occurring, the amount of carpenters building New York City and London, I mean, it's a tremendous undertaking. So even though there's money there, it's still being spread out and it's still being distributed certain ways. And obviously, yes, it's much more than Sing Sing. And yes, we had a lot more tools and toys and nonsense than Sing Sing, yes. But like, you're still not without a box there. If you look at our subway set, for example, like in the film, there's this long, pretty fun sequence where Sam and Eric are chased into the subway by these creatures. But, if I told you that our subway set was a 20-foot long tunnel in 4 feet of water, you'd be like, well, why did you shoot it like that? That seems crazy. And you're like, yeah, well, there are limitations that get put on you at all levels of scale. And I do think having worked in smaller films for a long time really kind of helps me adapt to situations like that, where it's like, well, this is definitely not the ideal way to do this, but and luckily I have a director like Michael who's also willing to kind of get creative, and with incredible support by ILM and our visual effects producer and supervisor Susan and Malcolm. We were able to kind of figure out a way to make that thing come alive, and ILM had a huge part of that. But you do have to be able to solve those problems on any scale, whether that be small or big. I don't know if that's what you're going for.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. During the movie, the focus shifts, or rather segments, from Sam only to Sam and Eric together after a transition period where Sam completely rejects him at first or just want to get rid of him and go on her own, then she still keeps some distance up until their stories completely intertwine. How does this splitting and then basically reassembling of the audience's attention translate into your cinematography and vice versa?
I think with, obviously the introduction of Eric in the film is a very pronounced moment, and it's done in such a way, it's done through Frodo, the cat, where Frodo ends up leaving Sam's side for a while and then discovers and comes across Eric, which I don't know, it was one of my favorite parts of the script when I was like, this is such a fun, incredible introduction to a character. I would say that I guess the considerations were that we were kind of true to Sam's perspective to a lot of the film, aside from this moment where we discover Eric. And I do think we do a good job of allowing the camera to kind of fall into Eric's mind for a moment when we do discover him and he meets the cat and they kind of have this moment of connection. However, I think once he returns to Sam, the camera it does favor her perspective of this man at this point, because we as an audience don't necessarily know who he is yet. We don't really know what his intentions or goals or where he came from. So we kind of did latch closer to Sam's POV and her subjectivity, I guess, of him. But, we were definitely conscious about how to frame them together after this moment. Because there's they kind of leave and there's this sort of two shot of them in the rain that kind of allows us to let the audience know that he's going to be becoming sort of more a part of our world. And then once we're into the apartment right after that, I feel like we're kind of lensing him just like her. So it kind of happens quickly from a visual standpoint, I think. But I don't feel like we were ever trying to necessarily alienate him from a viewer or treat him differently. More so just represent Sam's experience of meeting Eric closer to her POV.
Since you mentioned Frodo, the cat,
Yeah.
who, according to the internet, or for the people of the internet, became the true star of the movie, it looks as if it requires an almost entirely different approach and maybe even shooting technique to capture the scenes around the cat, even just the height difference, the difference in movement, and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about how this changes the perspective in those certain sequences?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think Michael and I were a little bit stubborn in a way where we kind of didn't really want to actually change how we photographed things for the cat. That was a big goal of ours. We never use CG, we never use VFX for a cat. There's a stuffed cat in certain sequences that we only used it in times where you really wouldn't be able to see it. And it was more something for Lupita to kind of work with. But we always wanted to maintain kind of the integrity of how we were planning on shooting the film without being we have to change this for the cat. So we oftentimes, early on, I think we struggled with it, in the first week or so, because we were trying to figure out, how do we deal with this cat in a certain way? And what's really funny is that it kind of clicked, I think, in our second week where we're like, listen, we just kind of need to let the cat be a cat. So in a lot of scenes, we would, rather than overly trying to do something with the trainers or try to think too much about it, an example would be, okay, they're just going to go into the apartment and we're going to be in this wide medium behind them. And let's just let the cat go and see what it does. And oftentimes we would get some of the best results from the cat by having the trainer just be inside and be like, hey, come over here, rather than trying to do certain specific things. That's not always the case in the film. When Frodo's jumping up on things and obviously those are very planned and trained moments, but those were always planned to be that way, the way we photographed them. But I think that the most fun discovery was allowing Frodo to kind of roam and play in a space, and how oftentimes that would be a better result than if we tried to overly control what he was doing. That was a pretty fun thing to kind of unlock as we went, basically kind of just taking your hands off it a little bit and allow the animal to be the animal, which I do think kind of helps with his performance in a lot of ways. And again, it's not every shot. There's some shots that are very specific, but and then there's some crazy things where he's in the subway with them, and he's soaking wet. And he's in a viola case. Then climbing, at the end when they jump into the water. And that's really, I don't know which cat it was, Nico or Schnitzel, but that's really him that pops out of the water, And there's obviously massive restrictions when you're doing this. You can only have the cat wet for I forget what it was, 2 minutes or something. And then they have to, not be wet for an hour or 30 minutes. There's lots of rules that are in place to protect the animals, which, it was fine. It was very interesting to see how much the cat was willing to do. And he got more comfortable as the film went on, which was fascinating because the more time he spent with Joe and Lupita, the more time that there were two cats. So it was Schnitzel and Nico. The more time they spent together, the more time the cat would trust what was happening was going to feel safe. So in that sequence, when you see Joe Quinn running down on the pier, the cat is chilling. It's not trying to get out of, he's full tilt sprinting down a pier and the cat's kind of okay, I guess this is fine. And, that's after spending, months together and stuff. So that whole process was fascinating. And Michael and I had done Pig together. So we had a very rambunctious pig on Pig that bit me and Nick and knocked shit over on our set. And it's always great chaos. So I remember reading this script. I was like, man, you really want to put a cat on us the whole movie, huh? And he's like, oh yeah. And I mean, and rightfully so. It was a beautiful part of the story and it's compelling. And it was and I think it transcended into magical a little bit on screen.
Pig, cat, what could be next?
Oh man, I'm almost certain we don't have animals in the next one. Almost certain. But, you never know. Michael might just drop one on us just for fun.
And now on to Sing Sing. My number one question is it actually shot on film?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And on that about $1 million budget.
Yeah, a little. I think it was slightly more than that. I don't know exactly. But it was definitely right around that range. And and that's something that it's not easy to do that. That's not just a cinematographer coming onto the project and being like, oh, it's on film, figure out how to make the money work. It was a big conversation between the producers and I early on where we were going to make sure we protected that because we felt that it was important on a lot of levels for the film. I think first being creatively, there's a lot of research that Greg and Clint did into this film. They had hours and hours of Zooms with a lot of the people that were in our cast who, I don't know if you know this, were, they were all formerly incarcerated with the exception of 3 people. And they were in the program at Sing Sing. So a lot of these guys they're playing versions of themselves to a certain degree. And I mean, in the credits, you see the videos of them actually in the plays on stage in the chapel at Sing Sing. Yeah. So, we had all of this. There was just piles of information beyond the script that, Greg would send me and I would be able to watch and kind of download and kind of get a feel for what we were capturing. And the more I watched it, there was this one moment that always struck me where talking about, maybe it could have been in this video, but it could have been just a conversation. But one of the guys talked about how he wore a watch all the time and he wore a watch in jail as a decorative piece because the time on the watch was always wrong. And I was it kind of shook me a bit because I was fascinated by this idea that it just didn't really matter in some ways. Their schedule is their schedule. Whether or not his watch is right doesn't matter. It's the system provides that. And then we kind of just started thinking about, when these guys were there and time as a whole and how their perception of time is so different than ours. It's a very different feeling. Our production designer, Ruta, used to use this phrase out of time, which I really came to love. And I think that was part of one of the reasons we wanted to shoot on film is because since we're representing a time when a lot of these guys were inside, it would have been film. And we also kind of wanted it to feel not of this time. We wanted the film not to feel like something that would just be, that feels like it was shot today, which I think when you watch it, there's this patina and this texture that we were able to kind of gather out of it. And the color, it does kind of make it feel like something that was shot in the 90s maybe, or at least I like to think that that's kind of where we were going for. So that was really a big creative driving force for me. And the other side of it, which people talk a lot less about, was the technical side. I mean, I had a very small crew. It was 8 of us, including me on grip electric camera. And so there was always, I knew that doing big lighting setups, doing lots of work in general to lighting or any of it was going to not really be that possible. And so I find that film is a very forgiving medium. You can light it 50% worse and it's going to look twice as good as digital lit, that's 50% better, So kind of knowing the limitations I was going into, I thought that film would be a tremendous asset, and being able to shoot, because we shot the movie. Another thing is we had Coleman for 14 days. So really and if you watch the movie, he's in almost every scene.
Yes.
So, we had 14 days with him, and then we had another additional 4 days with the rest of the guys. And then one day that was us kind of going up and shooting the, like a lot of the textures of Sing Sing, like the actual prison, like up on the river and all that stuff. So time was not my friend either. So like I wasn't going to have any time. I didn't have a big crew. So I was like, listen, film is the only way that I think I'm going to be able to capture these images with a level of humanity that is required of me, and not have to do all of the work that I would normally have to do to digital to really get that feeling like grounded and organic. You've seen the movie. There's lots of scenes that look 360 degrees and end up in like very unflattering front light that are just lit with windows. And I don't think that digital would have given me the sort of same honesty out of it all, or whatever that feeling is. I knew that digital it just wouldn't feel right. As from a technical standpoint, it was just a tremendous asset for me to be able to do what we actually did.
When reenacting or recreating the archival footage of the plays, to what extent was the goal to display them the most accurately possible?
The only things we recreated are 3 shots with Coleman in them.
Yeah.
The rest of it is all
the originals, yeah.
Yeah. So that's all originals. The stuff that we did with Coleman, that was something we had come up with in prep as a way to sort of explain, because it comes right after Clarence gets out. And it was our way to kind of show time in another way, rather than saying something like X amount of years later or whatever. Like, we wanted to kind of use these things to kind of like experience time the way they do. And for a lot of them who are in RTA, each show was another, like, okay, this show is out of the way, on to the next. And that was the way that time would move for them, and this is how they spent their time doing it. And so we obviously just wanted to use all the archival stuff we had, but we wanted to bring Coleman into it to help us understand that. And I think we did the best we could with what we had in the time we had to kind of like squeeze it in there. I mean, I don't think we were like as specific as matching it into a single certain play as we probably, we could have probably been more, but we didn't really have time or the assets to do that exactly the way, you could have. But I think in terms of the feeling that it chases, I think we kind of get that feeling across with what we did.
Oh, it works perfect. And at the same time, these shots of Coleman, lighting wise and just the close-ups, there is almost like a, dreamlike or transcendent feel to it. Was there a point to which you wanted to deviate from reality with these shots, or am I just seeing things into it?
No, I mean, listen, the wonderful thing about a movie, man, is that once you've seen it, it kind of belongs to you. It doesn't really belong to me. So feel free to project whatever you like onto it. I think that's what's wonderful about the format. We all find things in it that we care about. To answer the question, are you specifically talking about just those moments in the recreation of the archival, or do you mean in general?
Primarily, yeah, but if it fits other moments, then I'm more than open to hearing about them.
No, I mean, I don't think that was honestly on our radar to try to intend in any ways. I would say maybe the closest thing that we kind of do like that is we've always wanted the theater to kind of feel, there's a very intentional use of, like, we kind of go from a very, very uniform palette of the film. I think there was definitely a more bland version of a theater I could have done with more white light and more, but like color was an important part of, us. Once we kind of go into the theater world, we are bringing like color and vibrancy and life and kind of as a representation of what this thing is to a lot of these guys when they get to go in and, as Dino says in the movie, put on fancy clothes and dress up in things that are not in their reality. And so that was always, like, I would say that is the thing that kind of left reality the most, and also, the stage feels very big. It feels very like a big production that is occurring. And, as much as that is the case for what these guys were doing, it is, in the archival, you can see the sets they built were legit. They had legit lighting. They had a lot of things that they were doing. So we wanted to keep it true to that, but we also wanted to to raise it to kind of feel, I don't know, a little bit more for what they were experiencing.
We meet this tradition in the film that the inmates call each other beloved. And this is such a beautiful, earnest, and respectful detail you just cannot go past without mentioning. To kind of project this onto your work, what does mutual respect and love for one another mean to you in your professional life?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think if you talk to the people that know me and that work with me, it's something that is tremendously important to me. I think that filmmaking can be a bit of a broken system. And I think we've shown that it is a broken tool, and it's a thing that power is often misused or on people in ways that, obviously, we've seen shit in the news about it. We know those stories, but it can be used and it can be a space that makes people really feel very small. And it can be pretty toxic to an individual. I've been on the receiving end of plenty of that in a lot of situations, not even situations very long ago. It's important to me, and I think the beautiful thing about Sing Sing, more than any film I've ever worked on, is that it wasn't really at all like that. Everyone's voice was valuable. Everyone's voice was important. Everyone, and as you know, I'm sure you read it, everyone was paid exactly the same. Coleman and a PA made the exact same money, and that does bring a certain level of something to the set. Obviously, there's still a hierarchy because something needs to run. Somebody has to make the decisions, et cetera, et cetera. But everyone kind of felt part of it, and no one ever felt diminished, or at least from where I saw. And I don't know. I think that was maybe the most special part of the whole process, was the human experience of making the film. And making it this way about these guys with their real stories. Like, so much of it is tied up in each other. It's not just the script and the story and how it was made. All of it kind of like is together. Yeah, man, it was a pretty beautiful process. And it was honestly, it's a way that I wish you could make everything, or I wish every set could feel that way. Reality is that they don't. And it was sort of like, who knows, it might be the only time in my life that it gets to happen exactly that way. I don't know, but it was wonderful. It was a pretty life-changing experience for me. So I'm not going to be really good at articulating it, but hopefully that's kind of gets a feeling across.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a project you're currently shooting is Lurker. And I know you can't tell me much about it, so I'm not even gonna try and get into it. But what I do want to ask you is, as this is Alex's debut feature, and at the same time you're becoming more and more experienced, firstly, how does this change your approach and know-how in choosing projects? And what has been your general experience on this project, collaborating with Alex, shooting Archie?
Shooting with first-time directors is something that I've done for a while now. Michael, who directed Quiet Place, Pig was his first film. I did that for him. I did Ray Green's first film, Monsters and Men, who went on to do King Richard and some other film of the new Bob Marley movie. So first-time directors is not something I've ever shied away from particularly. I quite like there's like a hopefulness. There's a joy. There's something about not having done the process before that kind of makes it exhilarating for me too. It's the way that when people talk about having children and like you get to re-experience something for a child, and you get to experience it with them now for the first time. There's something like that with a first-time filmmaker where they kind of come into it with a certain mindset, and you kind of are trying your best to lift that up, even when things might not be possible or whatever. And you kind of have to help shape that film and let it come to reality. But like, there's this really amazing joy that they get out of the process, and I quite love being a part of being able to help them realize that and kind of like help get that on screen, and obviously like the more experienced you get, I mean, the better it is. I mean, you'd have to ask them about it, but Alex, I think, was very grateful of any guidance or any help that I could give. His writing is amazing. The script is amazing. The performances from Archie and Theo are phenomenal. It's a very cool little film. It was a really nice community, to help Alex kind of get this done, and I'm very excited for people to see that one. It's going to be interesting. Hopefully next winter, we'll see.
Can't wait. Last but not least, I was going to ask whether the death of Robin Hood will see you and Michael reunite once again, but in one of the interviews with him I listened to, and I'd like to shout out the guys at Rear Blend here. So he confirmed it on their show, and he also added that it's finally a collaboration between the two of you that will be shot on film. And shooting on film is another thing we previously talked about. So now my question is, what does this opportunity mean to you artistically to elevate your collaboration with Michael with this little addition as a cinematographer, and also personally as a movie or film lover?
Yeah, we've been talking about Robin Hood for a couple of years now. I mean, even before Quiet Place, Robin Hood was, he had mentioned it to me. I don't think I had read it at that point, but I was like, whoa, this sounds, and he had kind of given me the rundown of what it's about, which, I can't really talk about that, but I was like, this is going to be a pretty magical little thing. Hopefully we get to do it. I think that, I don't know, I can't really say enough good things about Michael and the collaboration that I feel very grateful to have found it in my life. I don't think that you have lots of collaborators, and there's lots of people that you might make a good movie with, or you might make a fucking bad movie with. And even if you make a good movie, you might not, everyone's really just not always meant to work together, or maybe doesn't see the world the same way. And, it's not always going to be the most perfect relationship. Michael says he'll tell people that, we agree 90% of the time, but the 10% we disagree, we really fucking disagree, is like how he likes to talk about it. I think we both love that, that aspect of like challenging, it's like we kind of challenge each other to be a little bit better. And there's very little ego in the room between him and I, which is, I think, kind of the death of filmmaking. When people get worried that their ideas or something, they feel their ideas like, being marginalized, but we might just shoot stuff down from each other, but it's in a way that's like, we're just trying to make the film and each other a little bit better. And to find someone else who kind of sees the same value in that is wonderful. And I feel really grateful for it. I think going into Robin Hood, what will be cool is that, on Pig, we were very budgetarily constrained. We had a short shooting schedule. We had 20 days. It was a $3 million movie, but there were some other costs that go other places in that movie that doesn't really, you're not really making a $3 million movie on the production side. Quiet Place, we obviously had a lot of money and a lot of things to mess around with, but with more money comes more oversight, more responsibility to the franchise, more responsibility to an audience who's expecting something from this franchise. I think with Robin Hood, it's like, it'll be kind of like now this sort of mixture of both. Obviously, our budget will not be something like The Quiet Place, but it'll be much more than Pig. And it's going to be something that we'll be able to kind of really exercise Michael's voice entirely uniquely and really come at it, I don't know, from our perspective, maybe more so than we were on the last one, and with greater opportunity than Pig. So I feel like it's a bit nerve-wracking because it's big shoes to fill, in my opinion. But I think the script is pretty incredible. So, and the cast that we've had now come onto it, I don't know if you've seen that, Jodie Comer and Hugh Jackman. Well, I just saw Jodie Comer in Bike Riders, and she was crazy. She was phenomenal in it. And Hugh Jackman, incredible acting. So I don't know. I'm extremely hyped. I can't wait, to be honest with you. I'm like, just like, let's start already,
Pat, thank you for taking the time, and congrats on your work on both projects. And also, can't wait to see what you do next.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. Look out for Lurker. That'll be a fun one to check out. And yeah, thank you for taking the time.